Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Sunday school lesson for September 20th. This week, we're going to be talking about Abraham. So here's what your sheet looks like for this week, for your Genesis story. So you can add that to the one from last week, Genesis 2, and start making our Bible. So if you just keep them in order, they'll be the right way up all the way through. So let's talk for a minute. Has anybody ever made a promise to you that they promised to do something, or maybe promised to have your favorite meal on your birthday, or to go somewhere fun when you celebrate? Or maybe someone makes a promise that they'll help clean up your room, or they'll take you someplace exciting like Adventureland or somewhere fun. So what happens if they can't keep their promise, or they can't keep their promise for a really long time? And then you start to wonder, are they ever going to keep their promise? Is it ever going to happen? Because sometimes things that get promised aren't hard to do. They're not difficult. I always promise my kids that on their birthday, they get to be in charge of the television. Especially if their birthday's on a weekday and we can't go someplace fun that year. And my kids are older now too. But they always got to be in charge of the TV on their actual birthday. They were in charge all day. And we had to watch what they wanted to watch. And nobody else could complain about it. And so sometimes we had to watch some things I really didn't care about watching. There were some cartoons and some movies that I went, oh boy. But we watched them because it was a promise I made. Now, in our story today, God makes a really big promise to Abraham. And the thing about God is God always keeps promises. Now, it might not happen just at the time we think it should, but God always keeps promises. And so let's take a minute to read our story, and then we can talk a little bit more about it. This one is called God's Promises to Abram. His name changes to Abraham later, but here he's still Abram. God came to Abram and made a promise. Abram, you are very special to me. I will take care of you and give you lots of children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. But Abram asked God many times, are you sure? I don't have any children yet. God thought Abram needed something more to help him understand. So God took Abram outside and showed him the night sky. Your family will include as many people as there are stars in the sky, God said to Abram. Abram stared up at all those stars. He couldn't begin to count all those twinkling lights. Stars and stars and stars all around him. Abram looked up at the stars and saw God at work. Abram believed God. Now for another promise, said God to Abram. You will need a place for your huge family to live. I will give you this land as I promised. Are you sure, God? Abram asked again. God made a covenant with Abram, a promise that Abram would become a father and a grandfather and a great-grandfather and a great-great-grandfather and a great-great-great-grandfather, and on and on and on. And all Abram's many, many sons, daughters, grandsons, and granddaughters would live with God in the land on which Abram stood. Now, think about that. It's hard for us, if we go outside at night, to see all the stars. We have too many lights around. Street lights, and people have lights on at their property, and then just all the lights that people have on in their houses, and all that light kind of shines up. So you can tell at night when you're driving toward a city because it's so bright, because there's so many lights on from stores and gas stations and all kinds of places. But when Abram lived, there weren't any lights yet. no electric lights, no light bulbs. All they had was a fire. So when he went out at night, it was really, really dark, so he could see all the stars. And he couldn't even begin to count them all. Couldn't even count them all. And God told him, this is how many descendants you're going to have. There's going to be so many people that come after you and your family that you won't be able to count them all. And that was how God showed Abram that the promise was still good. It was still going to happen. Even though it had been a bunch of years since God first made the promise, it was still going to happen. So you'll also see stars. I have a bunch of stars here, don't I? So one thing, maybe to help you remember the story, would be to color in a bunch of stars and see how many you can put on a sheet of paper and create some stars. I remember they used to sell, they might still, they were little stars that glowed in the dark that you could put up on your ceiling in your bedroom. I remember those when I was a kid. And then they would glow at night and you would have all the stars above you. It was really cool. Have you ever watched a movie or read a book, and in the story it gets to a point where everything seems hopeless? Most action movies are like that, like the Avengers movies and Star Wars and movies like that. There's usually a point where everything seems hopeless. And then suddenly, something comes in unexpectedly to save the day. Or sometimes it happens to real people, that everything seems hopeless. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, help arrives. That's kind of where Abram is in this story. He's been living in another country with his family for years now. God asked him to take all his family and all his stuff with him and to move, to go to the place God would show him, which he's done. But God also promised him that he would have, children and all these people to follow behind him, and none of that's happened yet. And it's been a bunch of years. And so now Abram's getting a little worried, and he's starting to think, maybe this isn't going to happen. It's that moment where everything just seems too much, that it's just not going to happen, that they're just not going to, God's promises just aren't going to happen. But here's a spot where God actually talks directly to Abram and says, no, I promise this, and it will happen. It might not be the day you expect, but it's going to happen. And so he takes him out and shows him all those beautiful stars. It's a great thing for us to remember too, isn't it? That sometimes when we feel like nothing's going to get better and nothing's going to change, just to remember that God is with us. And God has promised to always be with us. We're never really alone because God is always there. That's kind of a neat idea, isn't it? And it's nice to know that the promises that God makes to us in the Bible, God keeps. That those promises, they happen. Maybe not in the way we expected or at the time that we expected, but they still happen. So when you look up at the sky at night and see all the stars, what do you think? I mean, how do they make you feel? I think they're fun to look at. I love to drive out into the countryside at night and see all the stars. They're so beautiful up there, aren't they? Have you ever heard people talk about something being miraculous? Have you ever heard that word? It means that a miracle happened, that something unexpected happened that people just can't explain. And that usually means that God had a hand in it. And that's a nice feeling to know that God's out there looking out for us. Have you ever had to wait a long time for something? a really long time. In Abram's case, he'd already been waiting about 10 years at this point, and it was still a few more years until his son was born. That's a long time, isn't it? Especially when some of you aren't even 10 years old yet. 10 years is a really long time, isn't it? So, one other thing. The first thing that God said when he started talking to Abram was, don't be afraid. Do you think it would be scary if God started talking to us? I think I'd be a little scared. I wouldn't quite know what to think. Oh my goodness, is this God speaking? Oh boy. That to me sounds kind of scary, that God would speak to me directly. And yeah, that would just be a scary thing, I think. So I think it's probably good he told him not to be afraid, because I know I would be. It's real easy sometimes to get scared or to be upset when things haven't gone our way, or when there's something we're waiting for and it hasn't happened yet. It's easy to get real impatient and real cranky and to want it right now. But sometimes it's really important that we wait and that we learn things while we wait, and that we're not quite ready yet, or God has something really special in mind. And so we need to wait for the right time. So as we finish today, let's say a little prayer. Dear God, you made a promise to Abram that brought new life out of a place of sadness, even though he had to wait many, many years. Help us to trust you, even as we wait for the new things that you have promised for us. Amen. Well, I hope that you enjoyed this week's story, and I'll be back again real soon with next week's story. See you then. Bye-bye.